Hey, happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to the interview series where I pick a book, the author picks a drink, and we talk about both. Tonight's a good one. Tonight we're drinking a gin rickey, which I thought was just like a cocktail, but it's just gin and soda. They made it sound so fancy. But anyway, tonight's book is really, really exciting. It was a fascinating read. It's one of those books that you read, a fiction novel that you read and you're like, suddenly I need to read everything I can get my hands on about this. So it's set in the Carville Leper Home in Louisiana in the 1920s. And I had no idea. I had no idea. Everybody that I've talked to has had no idea. And this is a really fascinating book. So I'm so excited to have Amanda on to talk about it. I'm going to read the back cover copy because my mom likes it when I do that. And the book is called The Second Life of Muriel West, and it's got a gorgeous cover. I can't wait to talk about that too. Based on the true story of America's only leper colony, The Second Life of Muriel West brings vividly to life the Louisiana institution known as Carville, where thousands of people were stripped of their civil rights, branded as lepers, and forcibly quarantined throughout the entire 20th century. For Muriel West, a 1920s socialite married to a silent film star, the isolation and powerlessness of the Louisiana Leper Home is an unimaginable fall from her intoxicatingly chic life of bootleg champagne and the star-studded parties of Hollywood's golden age. When a doctor notices a pale patch of skin on her hand, she's immediately branded a leper and carted hundreds of miles from home to Carville, taking a new name to spare her family and famous husband the shame that accompanies the disease. At first, she hopes her exile will be brief, but those sent to Carville are more prisoners than patients, and their disease has no cure. Instead, she must find community and purpose within its walls, struggling to redefine her self-worth while fighting an unchosen fate. As a registered nurse, Amanda Skenadore's medical background adds layers of detail and authenticity to the experiences of patients and medical professionals at Carville. The isolation, stigma, experimental treatments, and disparate community. A tale of repulsion, resilience, and the roaring 20s. The Second Life of Muriel West is also the story of a health crisis in America's past, made all more poignant by the author's experiences during another all too recent crisis. Again, if that doesn't make you want to read it, something's wrong with you. Let's bring in Amanda.
Hi, cheers, everyone.
Hi, Amanda. You're a little bit frozen, but hopefully it'll work itself out. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Are you having a gin rickey as well? The most deceiving cocktail there ever was.
Yes. It's pretty simple, yeah.
Yeah, really.
But refreshing. I like it for a hot summer day.
Oh, it's the perfect drink. I've been drinking gin rickeys all summer long. I didn't know. So Amanda, to get right to it, how did this book come to you? How did this happen for you?
I was at my local library here. I live in Las Vegas. And I was just sort of trying to cast out for ideas for another story. And I'm fascinated by early medicine. And so I was sort of in that general section of the library. And I came across this tiny book called Carville Remembering Leprosy in America. And I was just sort of struck because I had never actually known that there was a period of time when leprosy was endemic in America. I had heard about the colony in Hawaii, Molokai, but not in the continental United States. And much of what was happening in Molokai was happening before Hawaii was officially part of the United States. And so this sort of didn't was jarring to what I had thought the history of leprosy to be. Again, it was something of like long ago times and faraway places. So I, immediately sat down. I found this little nook in the library and I read through this whole book. And I was so struck by so many things. One, my great, misconception about the disease. And, I always thought it was this very transmissible disease, very easy to catch. I had the same, I think, sort of misconceptions that a lot of people have about leprosy, that your limbs just fall off, and that there is this real public health need to sort of exile people with the disease. And that's not at all the case. But what really struck me and what was a huge part of the book was just the patient stories. These people who did contract the disease, and they were from all over the country, and they were shipped literally like in a boxcar oftentimes to this hospital in rural Louisiana, a lot of times kept in quarantine for their whole lives, and really, ripped apart from their families, and had to, not only struggle with the disease and being exiled, but also with the shame and stigma. It's one of those diseases that just carries so much needless moral weight, that really, again, their stories and their struggles and their triumphs really, they just spoke to me. And I thought, if I hadn't heard about this part of our history, maybe other people hadn't as well. And I wanted to share that with readers.
So, okay. So Muriel West is not a real person, or she is?
She is not. She's not. Of course, Carville, the setting of the book is real.
I was telling so many, in talking about this book, I was like, this is the true story of the woman that's married to this silent film. Well, you convinced me, Amanda. So, wow.
Oh, thank you.
Fabricated her whole, that's amazing. She was such an excellent way to put us in to Carville, because her life before was so dramatically different.
Mm-hmm. I think that's part of how she grew in my mind. A lot of what happens to her and a lot of what happens to the other patients, all of that is based off of, real circumstances, real events that happen to patients at Carville. Beyond this little book I read several memoirs. I visited Carville, the museum there now. So I tried to get a very good sense and a very real sense of what these patients were experiencing. But I did want to come at it, I guess, from this angle of a fictitious character. And that gave me sort of the liberty to make her, again, like you said, just very, very much a fish out of water. She's coming from this big city, this really glamorous, glitzy life, and into, what she considers the podunk part of nowhere.
Right. Without a prison and
mm-hmm.
It's funny. It's a dark world, mm-hmm. right? But and she's got a lot of things that she has to deal with. But there are moments of such levity with her that she's almost like what's her name? Alexis from Schitt's Creek. I don't know if you watched it. She shows up in all the wrong clothes, and she's trying to help, and she can't. And, I mean, like, we're laughing about it, but it was much needed levity. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering how hard that was to balance the light and the dark of this story.
That is, I think a difficult thing anytime that you're telling a story where there's a lot of tragedy, and there certainly is that with the history of Carville and how we treated these patients in our history. So I definitely had an eye toward wanting to bring some of that levity, and also to, I think, highlighting a little bit of the humor, a little bit of certainly the hope that these patients had, right? There was a lot of despair, a lot of death, but there were also moments of joy and connections, very, very important connections that they sort of cultivated between each other as a way to survive and form a new life.
Yeah, I mean, she kind of gets. Some people, it seems, in reading the book, really commit to this is my home now, and this is like, I've got to make this mm-hmm. good for myself and for other people. And there was like party planning happening in here. It was so charming. It was so mm-hmm. and lovely. Real quick, we have a question from Bev. Hi, Bev. Hi, Allie. Bev is wondering, in your research, how large of a colony, how big was Carville?
So when it very first started, it was very small. It began just as a facility for Louisiana, and then was later purchased by the federal government. And at that point, it grew to about 300 or 400 patients. Later on in its history, they had a few more, sometimes I think getting up slightly above 500. So it wasn't that there were ever huge populations of people with the disease in the United States, but it was something that we would call endemic, so that there was always this sort of low-lying incidents. And then again, like everyone was sent there. But when you think, 500 people maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but when I think about the space, right, it's a couple of buildings connected by a walkway with, the infirmary in the center, a couple of churches, and some ancillary buildings, and that's it. And that was really the confines of their world.
So when you were able to go and visit, like, how preserved is it? Like, what?
Yeah, so I think it's amazing how well preserved it was. It was actually an operational hospital until very recently. I think they ended, and the sort of hospital part was transferred in 1999. So, barely over 20 years ago. And then at that point, it was purchased by the Louisiana National Guard, and they kept a lot of the structures up. And so the old patient quarters are still there, and they're used for various like classrooms. The infirmary is still there, and it's used as housing for the National Guard. They also bring in at-risk youth and do a camp there. And so that's where they stay. I was able to stay there in the old infirmary. And then the museum is there. And so the museum, I think, has really helped preserve a lot of that history. And the two churches that were built on site, both of those are still working churches.
Wow. So it's still very much a community.
It is. And it's very, very neat to see. And I'm really grateful that the buildings, and just, I think the spirit of the place has been so well preserved. The museum curator is, I think, tireless in her efforts, and really, really believes, in the importance of preserving these people's stories.
Right. How difficult was it to find? You talk about it quite a bit in the book, and it's not a giant leap of imagination. The stigma was incredible, and she kind of Muriel keeps referencing like the Ben-Hur scene, and you're just like, gosh, did the Bible and Ben-Hur really just form our entire opinion on leprosy? I know that it is a horrible disease, but I don't know. I was really struck by that.
And I think because it is a relatively rare disease, these sorts of influences, Ben-Hur certainly, and then the Bible, which is not really leprosy at all, but called that, and that's what we take it to be. Like that's what forms our associations with that. And so it has, I think, disproportional weight, whereas something that, we would come in contact with every day would be able to see, oh, well, it's actually not like that. But without that sort of touch point of reference, these cultural things, I think, take on greater weight. And I read there were letters, of course, that I read at the archive there at Carville, and then through several memoirs, these stories of that stigma. It really comes through people whose families abandoned them the moment they learned about their diagnosis. People who were, just really chased from town to town to town because no one wanted someone with the disease close to them. You can see it too in the laws, right? Like it was entirely legal what was happening to these people, that they were being forcibly quarantined. They weren't allowed to ride public transportation. If they were able to be released because their disease had essentially arrested, they would get this piece of paper that said that you're no longer a menace, a public menace. And that, you kind of had to carry this paper around, which I think is very there's a counter purpose, right? Like if you have to show, look, I was a leper, but I'm not anymore. I'm not a menace anymore. That just perpetuates this idea,
right? That no one's going to believe
you don't belong.
So how was it difficult to find the first person narratives, or was it obviously this archive helped, and how much of those stories ended up in your book?
So a good deal of the stories ended up in the book because again, even though the characters themselves are sort of my imagining, right? I wanted it all to be based in truth, right? And so I was very lucky in that there are a handful of memoirs that were written. One, Miracle at Carville, was actually an international bestseller in the 50s. It was published, I think, in 1952. So it's a little bit hard to find now, but I was able to get a copy at the museum and some other people's memoirs. And then I just, between those and the letters and this initial book that I had read was published several years ago, and they were still able to do interviews with people who had been at the facility. So then I was able to take all of these pieces together and sort of form a picture of what life would have been like there. Wow,
that's incredible. One of the other things that I was really struck by, again, and it's part of that like balancing. Actually, I'm going to ask another question, and then we'll get to this question. So, how much did the story, like, you kind of got this idea, you were interested in this idea. How did the story percolate? How does your process work? How much does the story change while you're working on it? Was it harder to write or harder to edit?
In general, I like to outline. I'm a big outliner, so I do a lot of research in the front end so that I kind of have a sense of the subject matter and what would be plausible within the framework of the story, and then I'll outline and pretty detailed. So I've got almost a chapter by chapter outline, and I'll write, revise a little bit, and then send it off to my agent and some early beta readers. But with this book, the outlining did not serve me so well, and I sent it off to my agent, and he wrote back to me and he said, we've got a lot of problems here.
Oh no!
Yes,
lots of problems.
And with the character of Muriel was very unlikable, and I think she's still off-putting to a lot of readers, especially in the beginning. But he said she was just totally unlikable to the point that you're rooting against her, and and so I knew I had to. I think I didn't want to change her so much as to help show readers how they could identify with her earlier, and show where she was coming from, because she is coming from a place of grief and sort of her own experience, right? Like, we're all products of our own experience.
Expecting her to roll with these punches would be unreasonable, 100%.
Yeah, it wouldn't be realistic at all, and then you wouldn't get to see her grow, right? Like, that's the whole point. But so with this book, the editing took a long time, and I would say the first draft to the final draft changed like 75%. But then in the end, I think it just took me a little while to find the story. And I think because there is so much underlying sadness to a lot of these people's lives, that I was really focusing on a lot of the levity. And there was a lot about the various celebrations that they would have, all of these ways that they were coping, right? And trying to find meaning in life. And I think that's what I really glommed onto as a way of sort of evading the harder underlying truth.
Right.
And so the finished book, I think, is a better balance of those two, because I wanted to still tell a story of hope that was in the end uplifting, but also not whitewash, right? What had happened.
Yeah, glossing over what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I was really struck by, and I feel like you really did that. I feel like you balance that light and the dark very well.
Thank you.
And Muriel was, to me anyway, a delight start to finish. But I was like, I could read about the medical procedures and the experimentational treatments. I could read another whole book about that. Like, did you have to pull yourself back, or were you like, how was that research difficult? I mean, I know that you're a nurse. That must have been fascinating for you. How did that work out for you?
It was interesting, certainly from that, coming from, I think, my background, I am very interested in the history of medicine, and to see, how it's evolved today, and you'll read about things, treatments that they would do. I mean, even just sort of the way that they were experimenting on people, and it wasn't that it was not consented to. You have people here that are, like you said, essentially imprisoned, right, at this hospital. So if you're offering them a chance that maybe you're going to get better, they're going to jump on it. But there are still some things that I think we would absolutely find unethical today about the way that they, went about trying various treatment options on the patients. So that was really very, very interesting. And I did have to, I think, find a way to show what was going on, but from a lay perspective, because
that would have been tricky.
I want people to be able to understand what's going on, and to not, for it not to become this sort of, too hard-boiled scientific story, right? Ultimately, it's about the people and their experiences and their, their connections and their emotions. And so having Muriel, I think, sort of cross over into the medical side of things helped, because she has no background doing anything.
And it's funny that the I think it was the nuns were trying to convince her to kind of give a shit. You gotta you gotta give a shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so they kind of convince her that she could be part of finding a cure. And she struts into the
Yes.
it's I'm gonna find a cure. And again, that was another great moment of levity. I again reminded me of Alexis from Schitt's Creek. Just really delighted by that. The other thing that you have in this book is a very lovely and angsty, in the most delicious ways, romance. Muriel, she's married, she has kids. It doesn't seem like a great marriage, and then she ends up in this situation, and she meets a man. And how was that to sort of try to?
Yeah, that was something that took a little bit of finessing and balancing, I think. I loved, especially because it's hard, because her husband, he's in the beginning of the novel, when she's still in Hollywood, Los Angeles, but then he's absent for the rest of the book. So how do I, bring that in? And I loved playing with the letters that they write back and forth to each other, and to try to use that to chart for the reader the arc of their relationship.
Yeah, I love an epistolary. Is that the right word?
Yeah, epistolary. Yeah.
Yeah, it everything's between the lines, and I feel like you did a great job with that. He's saying these things, but you're also oh, yeah, what aren't you saying?
Yeah. And then Frank is one of my favorite characters. He's the man at the facility, and I just he has so much hope and strength, and I loved writing, the course of their friendship that grows through the novel, but then also finding ways to make it realistic, because again, Muriel is, not only is she married, but she's also she's got so much growth to do.
Yeah, she's vain and she's shallow, and yeah.
So to find a place where they can eventually meet up on equal terms, that was also a bit of a challenge, but a fun challenge, as I was writing that. And I always gravitate, I think, to love stories. My husband says I'm an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10 of romantics. So
you wanted that for them, right? You wanted that they're young people in this situation. So in the story, there are a couple of different escapes. Did that happen? Was that a thing that happened a lot at Carville?
Yeah, so that was something that I learned about early on that really fascinated me, that they would call it, the hole in the fence. And it was a way, for patients to escape. And sometimes it was just, they might escape just to go, it's kind of hard to envision, but the Mississippi River is right, you have the barbed wire fence that's keeping them in, and then this old kind of rutted river road, and then right up the levee then is the Mississippi River. And so sometimes they would just, escape to take a swim in the Mississippi River. But sometimes they were, trying to escape in earnest for many, many reasons, right? You had people who were the breadwinners for their family, and their family still needed them, even if the family didn't necessarily need them or didn't want them with them physically. They needed money to survive, right? And so people would sneak out for that reason. People would meet in the colony, and you were not allowed to marry. You were not allowed to even have a relationship, right? So all of that was illicit. So there are stories of people who would sneak out through this hole in the fence. They would cut some of the chain link and sneak out, and then go to New Orleans to get married, to get a marriage license and get married. And sometimes they would stay out, but a lot of times various circumstances would bring them back. So maybe one of the two their disease would get worse, and they would need the medical care that they could get at the facility, or they would be found out, and people would literally throw them out of town and sick the police on them, and so they would come back in chains at gunpoint. And then again, the stigma, right? It would follow you. So even if you were necessarily captured, at the end of the day, a lot of the time, that sort of isolated life on the outside, running constantly, trying to outrun the stigma and the disease, I think that would catch up with a lot of people, and they would come back for that reason, because Carville was the only place that they could exist without that, right?
Yeah.
Exist with people in a similar situation as they were in.
Bev has a question. How long did it take you to research and then write this book?
It took about just shy of 2 years, from my very, very first, researching to that whole editing, rewrite, to the end. So about 2 years.
And then another question. Wow, everybody's got lots to. Thanks, guys. Denise, hi, Denise. Amanda, what did you find most intriguing or even surprising to you as you followed the path of research for this book?
Hi, Denise. That's a great question. Thank you. I have to say, what did surprise me most was, again, because I think that there is so much sadness, and what a hard thing for these people to be experiencing, right? We've had just a taste of that with COVID, right? We
in our homes,
right? We've had to be quarantined and missed that connection. What really surprised me was the resilience, right? And this, I'm not going to make the blanket statement that everyone at Carville was able to sort of overcome their circumstances, but there were a select few that really, really pushed to create this community at Carville, where there were events that people could look forward to, ways to connect with the outside. And I think that resilience, right? The resilience of the human spirit and this relentless drive for connection.
Yeah.
That really, surprised me in an uplifting way when I read these people's stories.
Yeah. As I was reading your story, it did the same. So this is actually your third novel, and your first novel is a dual timeline and takes place in part at a residential school. Mm-hmm. Your second novel takes place in an undertaker's. And now we have a leper colony. What is drawing you? There's a lot of story, and this draws me to. I like this, but what draws you to it, and what a challenge.
Yeah, I don't necessarily stick to one time period or one sort of theme. What really draws me are these stories that I will come across. So like in the example of my first book, Between Earth and Sky, I was with my mother-in-law in Wisconsin. We were at a Native American casino, and I kind of wandered to the back, and I saw these pictures of kids in military outfits. And I was like, what is this? And she said, well, these are kids at a boarding school. And as if I should have recognized this, and I didn't. I knew nothing about these Native American boarding schools that were set up here in the States and in Canada. And it floored me, right? That what an important and tragic part of our history that is just, at least in my experience, not taught, right? So that's what drew me into that story. And the same thing with The Undertaker's Assistant. It was about Reconstruction. So that period right after the Civil War, we learned so much about the Civil War and this battle and that general, and almost nothing about Reconstruction, right? And what an important and misunderstood period of time. So I think that's where all these stories sort of have their similarity, is that it's something that I didn't learn about in my schooling and just my general, life. And I think they're important. I think these little bits of forgotten history, especially these marginalized voices, so important that they are shared so that we can, learn from the past, have a little bit of perspective in what's going on today, all of those things.
I mean, it is kind of remarkable. I mean, we're in Canada, and we're wrestling with this news that's happening where these unmarked graves are being found, and the way that it's not in any way better reconciliation. We're far from reconciliation, but the fact that my kids are being told about this, are being taught this, is so dramatically different than I was with you. We had no idea. We had no idea.
And I think that knowledge and admission, right, is an important first step.
Yeah. One more question from Bev. Thanks for coming, Bev, with all your questions. You said the hospital was open until 1999, Carville. Does that mean that the disease has been eradicated?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So the cure for leprosy, which we now call Hansen's disease, was actually discovered, I guess, for lack of a better word, at Carville, right? They found a treatment that worked. And today, leprosy is treated with antibiotics, completely outpatient. So they found the cure in the 1940s, and then were trialing it and trialing the best routes, the best formulations, that sort of thing. And then by the late 1950s, early 1960s, they had realized, okay, we can treat this disease as an outpatient disease. We don't need to keep people in isolation anymore. But you still, at that point, you had so many people at Carville who had been there their whole lives, or most of their whole lives, never, been out in the outside world. A lot of them did have very significant disabilities, whether they had gone blind or had to have their limbs amputated. And so, thankfully, they didn't just say, well, go out and good luck. They let a lot of those patients stay, and they continued to treat those patients and people on an outpatient basis there at Carville until 1999. The disease has not been eradicated. There's still about 250 or so people in the United States annually that are treated for the disease, but worldwide, it's much, much more. Several 100,000 people have the disease, and it's just a matter of, unfortunately, like I said, it's very treatable with antibiotics, but it's access to the drugs, and again, which is partly blocked by the stigma, I think, that still surrounds the disease, that these patients can't get the treatment that they need.
Amanda, have you? I mean, I know that this book just came out. You are incredibly busy working at a hospital, a nurse. Have you thought about the next thing? Like, have you got an idea? Are you working at all?
I am. I'm working on my next book. It's also has a slight medical flair about Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and about actually a thief, a thief who has to go into hiding there at the nursing school at Bellevue. It was the first nursing school in the United States that was founded in the 1870s. And so the book sort of looks at, what was that like? What was the dawn of nursing like in America, and how did that operate? Also, I think from a character who comes in from the complete outside.
Right. Oh my gosh. Well, that's really exciting. I, for one, will be reading it. For sure. Everybody out there, pick up this book if you're fascinated by this stuff as much as I was. And if you're like, gosh, it sounds so heavy, I will remind you, there is a beautiful love story. There are party plans, and Muriel really, you can't call her unlikable. You can't call her unlikable. She is vain and she is shallow, but her arc is gorgeous. It's really, really beautiful. So I really recommend this book. Amanda, thanks so much for coming by.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for stopping by.
Yeah, grab this book, have a drink, read a book, get the vaccine if you haven't. Stay safe, everybody. We'll see you next week. Bye.